Imagine a dinner party where the seating arrangement makes absolutely no sense. At one end of the table, you have a neoconservative hawk demanding massive government spending to expand America's military power globally. Sitting right next to him is a neoliberal economist, a Wall Street purist who demands the exact opposite, a shrunken government and total deregulation. And across from them sits a religious fundamentalist who doesn't care about economics but demands the state intervene heavily to legislate morality. By all logic, this dinner should end in a brawl. The big spender, the penny pincher, and the theocrat have goals that are completely mutually exclusive. The neoliberals' free market has no room for the fundamentalists' moral restrictions. The neocons' war machine bankrupts the neoliberals' small government. But in 1980, Ronald Reagan walked into that room and performed a magic trick. He didn't resolve their contradictions. He simply pointed a finger out the window and said, "Look at the liberal. That is your enemy." Suddenly, these three rival factions suppressed their infighting to form a comprehensive conservative coalition. It was a brilliant short-term strategy for winning elections, but it came with a devastating long-term cost. It transformed American politics from a system of negotiation into a rigid, binary war where victory makes right. This essay, written a decade ago, argues that the polarization paralyzing America today isn't a recent accident. It is the direct, mechanical result of that unnatural alliance formed in the 1980s. To understand why the American center has collapsed, we have to look at how that coalition was built and why it was destined to break the system. Okay, so let's unpack this. Our deep dive today is really all about the mechanical roots of political polarization.
We're looking at sources that argue the crisis we're in now is fundamentally structural. It's not, just about Twitter or cable news.
Right. It's about a strategic political project that started decades ago, something that created this adversarial, zero-sum political environment we're all living in.
So our mission for this is pretty clear. We're trying to trace a direct line from that initial, really unnatural political alliance.
That dinner party.
Exactly, that impossible dinner party, all the way to the intense division we feel today. So first, we'll break down the components of that project.
The 1980 coalition and how it evolved.
And how it evolved into its modern successor, which is, well, it's a blueprint focused on command and control of the state.
Not shrinking it.
No, controlling it. The second, we're going to get into the empirical data. We're going to see exactly how this polarization has made the U.S. an international outlier.
And we're using some pretty sophisticated metrics that show the different kinds of division we're facing. It's not all one thing. And finally, we'll look at the organist efforts, the multi-pronged approaches that are underway right now to try and rebuild the social cohesion that's been lost.
To do this right, we really have to get into the complexity of it all. We have to move past simple labels, Republican versus Democrat, and use the empirical evidence to see what's actually happening. Like, what's the difference between ideological spread, social dispersion, and group divergence?
These are the different flavors of polarization.
Exactly. And most importantly, we have to confront this central premise that today's hyperpolarized world is an intentional, mechanical result of that old coalition, a process that was just supercharged by rapid demographic and social change.
So let's go back to that unstable tripod from 1980. It's really hard to overstate how mutually exclusive the goals of these three pillars were.
Neoliberalism, neoconservatism, and religious fundamentalism.
The fact that they held hands for decades is, well, it's the core mystery we need to solve.
And the key really was prioritizing political victory over any kind of ideological consistency.
Winning was everything.
Everything. So you take the neoliberal pillar. This was driven by corporate capital, big business interests, and intellectual figures like Milton Friedman.
Right.
They saw government as just inherently inefficient. Their long-term goal, and this was famously said by Grover Norquist, was to shrink the state down to a size where you could metaphorically drown it in the bathtub.
And that meant what in practice?
It required relentless fiscal conservatism, deregulation across the board, and massive tax cuts, specifically to starve public spending. The whole promise was economic liberty through, radically reduced government.
But the conflict is right there, baked in from the start. The neoconservatives were, they were pragmatic hawks. They accepted the need for a huge, expensive state machine.
They championed the expansion of U.S. global hegemonic power.
Which means money. Lots of it.
A ton of it. That means massive continuous investment in the defense industry, a sprawling intelligence and national security state, and foreign interventions that guarantee huge government spending.
So how did the neoliberals, the ones demanding fiscal restraint, justify supporting a neocon agenda that was guaranteed to create massive public debt?
That's the political genius of the whole coalition. The debt itself became a political tool.
Weaponized debt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The neoliberals accepted the neocon spending on defense, which was, very popular during the Cold War, and they coupled it with these radical tax cuts.
And the result?
Massive, structural, completely unavoidable deficits. And these deficits then served the neoliberal goal because they created this perpetual pressure to slash all domestic spending.
I see.
So by strategically starving the government of tax dollars, they made it less effective in areas people care about: infrastructure, social services, education. And in doing so, they proved their own core political theory that government fails.
So the conflict wasn't actually resolved, it was just redirected. The neocons got their giant defense budget, and the neoliberals got the fiscal crisis that came with it, which they then used to dismantle the New Deal social state.
Precisely. And then you have the third pillar, the religious fundamentalists. They supply the energy, the grassroots mobilization.
The ground game.
The ground game. They cared about the tax cuts for, business owners in their communities, but their main demand was that the state must intervene, and intervene heavily.
But intervene to do what?
To legislate and enforce social morality. They transformed cultural conservatism from just one part of the platform into this moralizing, anti-liberal religious force that tried to define real Americans as exclusively Christian. So the unifying force for all three of these clashing groups was this war on public trust. And you're saying this wasn't an accident?
Not at all. It was the explicit strategy used by corporate capital and the neoliberals to systematically dismantle the New Deal consensus. It was a very sophisticated two-pronged attack.
Okay, what were the two prongs?
The first was rhetorical. It involved promoting this myth of rugged individualism, which suggested that anyone who needed public services was somehow failing morally.
And at the same time, relentlessly disparaging public institutions. Everything from public schools to the EPA to break down public confidence in the whole system.
And the second prong?
The financial one, which we just talked about. Starving the beast. The deficits became the mechanism. By making government inherently ineffective, they could justify privatizing public goods, which was the ultimate economic goal for the corporate and neoliberal wing.
And this whole strategy had a deeply troubling requirement. It couldn't work without racially and ethnically divisive politics. You can't just cut services for everyone without making some people the scapegoat.
That is the crucial and often overlooked historical link. To justify dismantling programs that were actually quite popular, they had to demonize the people who used them.
This is where we get the toxic rhetoric.
Exactly. This is the origin of framing people who relied on welfare or food assistance or housing programs, who were often poor, non-white, and from the lower working classes, as somehow undeserving outsiders.
The welfare queens.
The welfare queens, the line cutters. This kind of race-baiting language was absolutely essential to fracture the political consensus and make austerity and privatization seem politically okay. It really confirms that the erosion of public trust wasn't about a pure belief in small government.
What was it about then?
It was about a pursuit of power that required dismantling the multiracial democratic consensus that the New Deal had built.
What's so sobering is that this historical project, it didn't just end. It evolved into something, I think, far more comprehensive. If the 1980 goal was the diminution of the state, starving it until it failed, the modern project is about something else entirely.
It's about command and control.
Which you can see embodied in this massive 887-page blueprint for the next conservative president, the 2025 mandate for leadership.
That is the fundamental strategic shift. The 1980s coalition, they were willing to tolerate an incompetent, debt-ridden state as long as it was shrinking. The modern agenda sees the state itself as the ultimate prize to be won. That manifesto is a plan to capture the state apparatus, to dominate institutions, and to use federal power to aggressively prosecute the anti-wokeism culture wars.
For a very specific ideology.
On behalf of a deeply conservative nationalist ideology.
Let's actually detail that shift in a few key areas, starting with education. The old neoliberal goal was, vouchers and fiscal control.
Mostly, yes.
What does the command and control blueprint demand now?
Well, it explicitly calls for the elimination of the Department of Education, sure. But its replacement strategy is way more intrusive than just cutting budgets. It demands the full implementation of Milton Friedman's model.
Which is?
Publicly funded, but family-led education decisions. Basically, education savings accounts funded by local and state taxpayers. This shifts the financial burden and empowers ideological choice over public good. And crucially, this plan is not neutral. It's not about choice for choice's sake. It mandates strict ideological control over curriculum and pedagogy for the entire country.
What does that look like in practice?
It means the removal of critical race theory. It means removing any teachings on radical gender biology from public schools. It means enforcing rules on pronoun usage. And it means directing federal funding toward programs that aggressively push free market ideology and a kind of nativist version of history.
So the goal isn't just to defund public education.
No. The goal is the comprehensive reconstruction of the entire public education system into a singular, culturally conservative image, using state funds to enforce that ideological conformity.
And we see the same demand for ideological alignment over injustice and intelligence. The document says, and I'm quoting here, that the DOJ and the FBI have been captured by radical left ideologues and have lost their way.
And that narrative, this idea that nonpartisan federal agencies are inherently biased, is the political red herring. It's the excuse used to justify a massive increase in centralized executive power.
So they use claims of historical misconduct, like the Trump-Russia investigation or the Hunter Biden laptop story.
Right. All of that is used to assert that a conservative president must, as soon as they get into office, politically align these departments.
What does politically align even mean for institutions that are designed to be neutral?
It means making them directly accountable to the president's political demands. The plan proposes an immediate, comprehensive political review of all ongoing FBI investigations and activities.
A political review of criminal investigations?
Yes. And it targets the abolition of the current federal employment status for thousands of nonpartisan administrative workers.
The civil service.
The professional civil service, yes. It wants to replace it with something called Schedule F employment status. This reclassifies policy-making federal employees, which allows the president to fire them at will and replace them with politically vetted loyalists.
So you're moving the whole system away from meritocracy.
And toward ideological loyalty. It ensures the entire administrative state, including the power to prosecute political opponents or drop investigations into allies, is under the direct thumb of the chief executive.
So the big takeaway from this first part is that the polarization we feel isn't just some accidental infighting. It's the mechanical, structural result of a decades-long political project.
A project that moved from wanting to shrink government to wanting to aggressively control it for ideological ends.
And that binary war brings us to the data, to see how the U.S. now compares to the rest of the world.
And as we shift into the empirical evidence, it's really vital to remember that distinction we made at the top. The difference between issue polarization and affective polarization.
Right. Issue polarization is the healthy stuff. The normal disagreement over tax rates or infrastructure or healthcare policy.
The stuff of normal democracy.
But the crisis we are living through, that's primarily affective polarization. It's the deep hostility, the visceral hatred, the profound distrust.
It's that sense of existential threat that's directed not at a policy, but at the people who hold the opposing political identity.
The toxicity of it all.
That's the toxicity. In the U.S. today, your political orientation has metastasized into what some researchers call a mega-identity.
A mega-identity.
Yeah. It's no longer just a set of beliefs about policy. It's now linked to your social networks, who you marry, where you choose to live, the media you consume, your entire moral framework.
And when people feel that their political opponents are not just wrong, but morally corrupt or fundamentally evil,
then the space for negotiation, for compromise, it just evaporates.
So if we connect this back to the bigger picture, the data is what confirms that the U.S. political system is, well, uniquely broken compared to its peers.
Absolutely. We analyzed data comparing the U.S. to 11 other established democracies, countries in the OECD bloc over the last 4 decades. And we were specifically tracking the rate of change in this affective polarization.
And the results?
The results are stark. The United States experienced the most rapid and the most substantial rise in affective polarization among all 12 of those countries.
By how much?
Our estimated linear trend was an acceleration of 5.6 points per decade. And to put that in perspective, this massive increase was happening while many other established mature democracies like Norway, Britain, Australia, even Japan, saw negative or statistically insignificant trends.
So while we were getting more divided, they were holding steady or even coming together.
Exactly. 6 of the 12 countries actually saw a decrease in effective polarization over this same period. The U.S. truly stands alone as an outlier. We're accelerating division while others are moderating.
That just raises a huge question. If polarization is this complex thing involving policy and identity and emotion, how do researchers even measure it beyond a simple approval rating?
Right.
We have to deconstruct the measurement because the solution really depends on understanding what kind of division we're actually dealing with.
Precisely. The analysis we're looking at uses 5 crucial dimensions, and these are derived from really granular county-level election data. These distinctions allow for a much more accurate diagnosis than just saying we are divided.
Okay, so let's start with spread and dispersion. They sound kind of similar, but they capture 2 very different aspects of the ideological range.
Spread is the easiest one to visualize. It just measures the overall ideological range of positions that are held in a place.
So like the distance between the most liberal and most conservative person in a town.
Exactly. The difference between the most liberal precinct and the most conservative precinct within a county. A higher spread just means the boundaries of political talk have expanded. You're incorporating more extreme positions into the local political conversation. It defines the ideological latitude, if you will.
Okay, so what's dispersion?
Dispersion measures how the opinions are distributed within that range. It's a measure of variance, or, and this is the key part, clustering at the extremes.
So not just how far apart the extremes are, but how many people are at those extremes.
Right. If a community has high dispersion, it means the population is clustering bimodally in 2 distinct political groups, with a relatively empty center. Low dispersion would suggest opinions are more smoothly spread out across the middle, indicating a more politically cohesive community.
So if a county has both a high spread and a high dispersion, that means the most extreme viewpoints are very far apart. And most people are clustered near those extremes, with almost nobody left in the middle.
That would be a highly polarized and fractured community. Now we contrast that with divergence. This metric measures the absolute distance between the centers of the 2 main attitude clusters.
The peaks of the 2 mountains.
Perfect analogy. If you imagine 2 mountains of opinion, spread defines the distance from the base of the left mountain to the base of the right. Divergence measures the horizontal distance between the 2 mountain peaks themselves. It captures the size of the ideological gap between the median Democrat and the median Republican.
I can see how this leads to more nuanced diagnoses. You could have a community with a high spread, a few extremists on either side, but low dispersion and low divergence?
Meaning the vast majority of people are still moderate and close to the center, even if the fringes are loud.
Exactly.
And then we have to look at the political structure itself. Group distinctness measures the deviation from 2-party dominance. It basically quantifies the percentage of votes cast for third parties or independent candidates.
So if distinctness is high, it means the 2 major parties are failing to capture the electorate.
Right. Maybe because their platforms are too similar, or maybe they're just too far from the median voter. And finally, you have size parity. This just quantifies the relative balance in size between the opposing groups.
How close to 50-50 the district is.
Right. And polarization often creates the most intense conflict when groups are near perfect parity, a score closer to 1, because that balanced competition encourages zero-sum, high-stakes political conflict, which leads to gridlock.
The key insight here is really the dynamic interplay of these 5 measures. If we only measured spread, we might think every diverse county is polarized. But by looking at divergence and dispersion, we can actually see if the groups themselves are moving apart, or if the extremes are just getting louder, or if the competition is simply becoming more evenly matched. It's a much more accurate diagnosis of the system's breakdown.
And this engineered political polarization, this binary zero-sum war, it didn't just happen in a vacuum. It intersected with this extremely rapid acceleration of demographic and societal shifts.
And that created the perfect psychological conditions for all this affective hostility.
The cultural tectonic plates of the U.S. have moved dramatically in just the last half-century. These changes, they strain the psychological pillars of both our personal and our collective identity. The speed of it alone is just destabilizing.
The data on that demographic acceleration is pretty mind-boggling.
It is. Since the 1970s, the percentage of non-white people in the U.S. has tripled. The portion of foreign-born persons has also tripled, and it's now sitting at roughly 13.7% of the population.
Right.
And at the same time, the manufacturing workforce has declined by 2/3, and births to unmarried women have quadrupled. This is not gradual change. This is a radical social realignment happening over just 2 generations.
And that specific figure, the tripling of the foreign-born share to around 13.7%, that seems to be a kind of psychological trigger point in American history.
It is a critical historical marker. The sources show that whenever the foreign-born population has reached this level in U.S. history, it has consistently triggered a powerful populist and nativist political backlash.
We've seen this before.
We saw the anti-immigrant and anti-labor movements peaking around the 1880s, which led to policies like the Chinese Exclusion Act. We saw the nativist fervor of the 1910s and 1920s, which led to highly restrictive immigration quotas.
So we're seeing it again today.
We're seeing it today. It's manifesting in political movements focused on border security and cultural preservation. It suggests a systemic identity strain that's inherent in this kind of high-speed demographic change.
And these huge economic and demographic changes, they interact directly with people's personal identity, especially when you look at, say, segments of the traditional working class.
Mm-hmm.
If you take the example of an older, white, male manufacturing worker, economic stagnation stops being just an economic issue. It becomes a deep personal crisis.
It becomes a question of cultural status and identity, not just about your income. Historically, their identity was tied to being the stable breadwinner, being able to achieve a comfortable, secure, middle-class life that allowed their spouse to prioritize domestic life.
Right, the American dream.
The post-war American dream. And when they find themselves unable to achieve or maintain that income level, when they can't match their own father's standard of living, it poses this profound challenge to their perceived manhood and their social standing.
And what about the changing role of women?
Well, the growth in female labor force participation, which is economically necessary for many families, is perceived by this specific group not as general economic progress, but as an acute economic threat to their traditional role as the exclusive family provider.
So this anxiety becomes political fuel.
It becomes weaponized by political rhetoric that blames these economic insecurities on cultural shifts and on others, rather than on economic policy.
And this anxiety, this feeling of identity threat, it then translates directly into the massive partisan division on core identity issues. The chasm of perception is just staggering.
Look at the data on cultural fear. When you ask about cultural continuity, a striking 8 out of 10 Republicans believe America is actively in danger of losing its essential culture and identity.
8 out of 10.
And that fear is shared by only about 1/3 of Democrats. That gulf suggests 2 parties living in 2 fundamentally different cultural realities.
And that split extends deeply into issues of race and perceived inequality.
It does. When Americans are asked if it is significantly more difficult to be black in the U.S. than it is to be white, 74% of Democrats agree. Only 9% of Republicans concur.
A 65-point difference.
A 65-point difference. It shows that race itself is no longer viewed as a policy issue. It's an identity issue, deeply embedded in that polarized mega-identity. It's a fundamental disagreement over objective reality, not just over policy solutions.
And we see that same moral split playing out in issues around gender and religion.
Absolutely. The tension between religious liberty and non-discrimination has become a proxy war for cultural control. Data shows that more than half of all Republicans believe a small business owner should be legally permitted to refuse service to a gay couple based on religious beliefs.
And for Democrats.
Less than 1/3 of Democrats hold that view. It highlights a foundational moral and social disagreement about whether religious practice should exempt someone from shared democratic norms of non-discrimination. And this collective anxiety, it all ties back to the zero-sum view of freedom. This exclusivist definition of liberty suggests that rights expansion for one group, whether it's racial minorities, immigrants, or LGBTQ+ individuals, must, by necessity, come at a subtraction from the rights or the status of the historically dominant group.
So the narrative becomes, if others gain, I must lose. My status, my culture, even my economic freedom is threatened. This is where we see variants of the Great Replacement theory getting politically activated.
That's the conclusion. This narrative successfully frames equality as a threat. A rising tide is not seen as lifting all ships. It's seen as washing away the established cultural foundation. The political project successfully leveraged demographic pain and identity anxiety to solidify the coalition, framing the culture war as a necessary defense against these undeserving outsiders who are trying to replace the real Americans.
Okay, so we've established the historical political mechanism and the fuel of demographic anxiety. Now let's look at the actual wiring of our society, our social networks, because the data here is really counterintuitive. It challenges that easy narrative of echo chambers.
We often assume that strong, dense, local social networks, tight-knit communities, that they reinforce political homogeneity. But an analysis using Facebook friendship data to calculate the support ratio, or SR, which is a measure of dense local connections within a county, it revealed a paradox.
And what was that surprising finding?
Denser social networks were found to be significantly associated with increased dispersion polarization.
Increased dispersion, so more clustering at the extremes.
Right, so if density leads to increased dispersion, it means these tight-knit communities actually support a more varied political landscape. A more polarized one, yes, but one where different viewpoints are actively maintained.
Wait, that seems backward. If the community is really tight, shouldn't everyone in the group apply social pressure to conform politically, to create homogeneity? Why would density facilitate more varied political expression?
Well, the sources suggest that perhaps in these dense, high SR communities, people trust one another enough to express non-conforming political viewpoints without fearing complete social ostracism.
Oh, I see.
An echo chamber implies censorship or exclusion. High dispersion in a dense network suggests the community is just politically complex. It's arguing loudly, it's clustering bimodally, but it's doing so within a shared social space, rather than just reinforcing a monolithic view. This fundamentally complicates that simple echo chamber metaphor.
That's a critical distinction.
Right.
Okay, now let's contrast that with how connections between counties affect polarization using the Social Connectedness Index, or SCI.
The SCI measures the relative connection strength between geographically separate areas, again, using Facebook friendship links. And here, the effects are more complex.
Oh, so
Stronger cross-county connections were shown to slightly decrease overall polarization levels across the connected regions.
So connecting with people from other places is generally a good thing.
It seems so. However, the key finding is that stronger SCI is also consistently associated with increased similarity in polarization patterns between the connected counties. It's a phenomenon called homophily or social influence.
So if my county is highly polarized, and I have a lot of friends in your county,
Your county is likely to develop the same high level and the same type of polarization as mine. Social influence works to create shared political norms, whether those norms are moderate or extreme.
and I'm guessing physical distance still remains a massive factor, right? It seems like even in the digital age, geography still anchors our political reality.
Absolutely. When they mapped the similarity and polarization against geographic distance, the similarity was by far the strongest for the closest 10% of county pairs. Physical proximity remains a vital, anchoring factor in shaping political alignment and the spread of political norms.
Okay, let's turn to the complex role of diversity. We established earlier that racial and educational diversity can fuel identity anxiety, which leads to division. But how does diversity actually reconcile with these specific polarization measures, particularly divergence?
We found that both racial and educational diversity strongly predict higher spread and higher dispersion. And this makes intuitive sense.
Right. A community with more diverse backgrounds naturally has a wider range of political views.
A wider range, high spread, and those views are more varied, high dispersion. Diversity creates complexity, which can translate into more arguments.
But there's a twist.
But here's the major counterintuitive finding. Educational diversity showed a significant negative association with divergence.
Negative, so it reduces divergence.
Yes. It means that while having diverse educational backgrounds in a community increases the range and variance of views, it simultaneously reduces the ideological separation between the centers of the two main political groups.
Wait, so if educational diversity reduces divergence, that means it keeps the Republican peak and the Democratic peak closer together ideologically, even if the range of voices in the community is wider. Why? Why would greater educational complexity moderate the distance between the groups themselves?
One interpretation is that education, even if it's ideologically diverse, might foster shared cognitive skills.
Like what?
Like critical thinking, or exposure to varied information, or respect for structured argumentation. These shared skills might reduce the tendency for groups to drift off into completely separate ideological universes. In essence, it suggests that while diversity might increase complexity and friction, higher spread and dispersion, it may also provide the communicative and cognitive tools necessary to prevent the most extreme ideological separation.
So, lower divergence.
Lower divergence. This is a crucial finding for understanding what makes a community stable.
That reframes the whole debate about diversity and polarization. Okay, let's tackle the final and maybe most complex enigma: the relationship between polarization and national trust between 2016 and 2020. Conventional wisdom says polarization destroys trust.
Yet the descriptive data from that period, one of the most intensely polarized periods in modern history, shows a really bizarre trend. While measures of political extremity, like spread and parity, increased nationwide, national confidence in both governmental and non-governmental institutions also universally increased.
You mean confidence in historically unpopular institutions like Congress went up by 44%, and confidence in the media went up 20% during the peak of partisan rancor. That is absolutely contradictory to the idea that polarization equals a total loss of faith in the system.
It is the trust enigma. And the conclusion drawn from this is that heightened political engagement and stronger, more salient partisan identities might actually coincide with higher institutional confidence, not lower. This is explained by what's called the partisan attachment hypothesis.
Okay, what's that?
When partisan identity becomes that mega identity we talked about, partisans become intensely loyal to the institutions they perceive their side to control. So if the media or Congress or the military are viewed as being on our side in the binary war, confidence in those institutions surges among that group.
Even if the opposing group simultaneously views them with complete contempt.
Exactly. Polarization doesn't necessarily create generalized cynicism. It creates highly specific, hyperpartisan loyalty and faith in institutions aligned with one's team. It's not a generalized loss of faith, but a hyperpartisan alignment of faith.
That puts an entirely new lens on what we perceive as a loss of trust. It's not trust that's eroded, it's the shared trust in neutral institutions that's been replaced by partisan trust in aligned institutions.
And recognizing this complex mechanical source of polarization, rooted in political strategy, identity thread, and these paradoxical social connections, that's what moves us towards systemic solutions. The goal is to rebuild social cohesion.
Which you're defining as a condition where people have trusting social networks and a shared sense of inclusion and belonging within the larger community.
Right. And this requires a fundamental cultural change.
Our sources suggest 5 distinct pathways for rebuilding this cohesion, focusing on shifting norms, values, and behaviors. Let's start with pathway 1, bridge building.
Bridge building focuses on creating structured processes to deepen understanding and facilitate shared goals across the partisan divide. One of the most effective models is called reciprocal group reflection, which has been popularized by organizations like Braver Angels.
How does that specific model operate?
It's highly structured. It often borrows techniques from family therapy and marital counseling, actually. It brings dedicated partisans, committed Republicans and committed Democrats together in a controlled environment.
And they don't debate policy.
No, they're not there to debate policy. They're there to engage in reflective listening, to share their life stories and their values, and to articulate what they misunderstand about the opposing side, not what they hate about it. And the research from randomized controlled experiments has demonstrated that this model significantly reduces partisan polarization and effective hostility among the participants.
So it works.
It works. Another crucial model is deliberative polling. The America in One Room experiment back in 2019 demonstrated the power of deep, structured deliberation. After they were exposed to balanced information and had detailed discussions with diverse peers, both Republican and Democratic participants moved closer to one another on 22 of 26 tested policy proposals.
22 out of 26.
It decreased both their issue and their effective polarization.
That suggests the distance isn't fixed. It's a function of the political environment, which can be manipulated positively. Okay, pathway number 2 focuses on skill building, teaching individuals how to engage constructively across difference.
This involves methodologies like reflective structured dialogue, or RSD, which systematically applies principles from mediation, conflict resolution, and group dynamics.
And what does that do?
RSD is proven effective at increasing social cohesion, fostering community resilience, and generating a shared sense of belonging by teaching specific listening and communication skills that break down that adversarial posturing. Organizations like Citizen University, through their Civic Saturdays gatherings, also work to reinforce these civic skills and a sense of shared purpose.
But this pathway, it comes with a crucial caveat, what's called the empathy warning. Why is empathy a double-edged sword when you're trying to cross political divides?
Research reveals a really complex reality about empathy. People who score high in cognitive empathy, that's understanding another's perspective, and especially those high in empathic concern, feelings of sympathy and compassion, are indeed more comfortable interacting with outpartisans. They're less anxious about it.
Okay, that sounds good so far.
However, the same studies found that high empathic concern did not reduce, and in some cases even increased, in-group loyalty and out-group hostility.
How is that possible?
The mechanism seems to be that feeling more deeply for one's own side while simultaneously understanding the other side can lead to increased moral indignation. You're better equipped to talk to your opponent, but you might also view them as a more potent moral threat because you understand why they hold what you see as a toxic view.
So skill building has to be more than just feeling.
It has to focus not just on emotional connection, but on managing the moral conflict that results from it.
Okay, moving to pathway 3, inclusion and belonging. This pathway recognizes that structural inequalities, racial, economic, and geographic, are often the source of the pain that polarization exploits in the first place.
This focuses on promoting genuine pluralism, the condition where multiple differing ideologies can peacefully coexist without any single group dominating or marginalizing others.
And what are the strategies there?
Strategies here include the truth, racial healing and transformation processes, or TRHT. These processes, often using racial healing circles modeled on indigenous practices, create intentional spaces for diverse groups to acknowledge the lingering effects of systemic racism, to build shared empathy, and to affirm a common humanity. It tackles that zero-sum anxiety head-on.
And what about the geographic divides?
Inclusion also requires bridging those growing chasms, particularly the urban-rural divide, which has become a primary driver of political polarization. Organizations like Urban Rural Action use constructive dialogues and collaborative design to bring together Americans across this geographic divide, ensuring that communities that feel economically and culturally forgotten are heard, which helps mitigate the resentment that fuels the affective hostility.
Pathway number 4, transforming collective settings, seems to be about infusing these ideals into our everyday lives, in the places where we already gather.
Exactly. The idea is to deliberately reconfigure existing non-political settings, our faith communities, our workplaces, sports leagues, civic groups, to explicitly focus on cohesion.
How do you do that?
This involves leveraging repurposed civic assets. Think about using public parks, local libraries, and community recreation centers, not just for their primary use, but as physical infrastructure designed to facilitate social mixing, trust building, and low-stakes cross-group engagement at the hyperlocal level. Building trust often begins with just sharing neutral space, not debating politics.
And finally, pathway 5, narrative change. This seems crucial because polarization thrives on the story that the other side is inherently monolithic and evil.
Narrative change is about deliberately challenging the dominant cultural stories that exacerbate division. This includes directly countering the persistent media narrative that American politics is defined solely by extreme partisan divides.
By showing that's not the whole picture.
By highlighting the reality of the exhausted majority, the two-thirds of the country that is in fact ideologically flexible, they're compromise-seeking, and they're just tired of the constant fighting. If we can shift the social norm from expecting conflict to demanding collaboration, that's a huge step.
And it also involves media and entertainment.
It does. It includes leveraging entertainment and creative media. Stories are incredibly powerful tools for changing norms. By creating documentaries, films, and narratives that humanize political others and model effective cross-partisan engagement, we can shift cultural expectations, reduce intergroup hostility, and allow people to see their political opponents as flawed humans, not as existential monsters.
So, after all of this, what does it all mean for you, the listener? We started with the mechanical breakdown of American politics in 1980, that moment the unnatural coalition was formed, and we've traced that initial spark all the way through to the U.S. having this global outlier status and effective polarization today.
The chain is pretty evident when you lay it all out. The tactical suppression of those deep ideological conflicts, neoliberal, neocon, fundamentalist, created a rigid binary war by focusing on a common enemy. This mechanical structure then accelerated the effects of rapid demographic change and identity anxiety, transforming political affiliation into that toxic mega-identity and resulting in a measurable, effective polarization crisis that just outpaces the rest of the developed world.
And that initial political strategy, the one that was sold to the American people as a way to liberate the individual by drowning the government in the bathtub, has now evolved into the modern, detailed blueprint for total ideological control of the state.
The history really confirms the long game. The right-wing erosion of confidence in public institutions, from the Reagan-era condemnation of government to the modern anti-wokeism movement's detailed blueprint for command and control, it was never truly driven by a principled, pure belief in small government.
It was something else.
It was always a strategic and tenacious effort to seize and control the administrative state and impose ideological conformity on a diverse population. The manifesto for the next conservative president is not a plan for diminution. It is a meticulously detailed plan for authoritarian command. And America, it really stands at a crossroads where the ideological battle is not about whether government should exist or even how big it should be. The battle is centered on whether the system will operate as a multiracial democracy, one that, however messy, values difference and equality, or no democracy at all. The current era is framed by revolution seeking not policy change, but the outright seizure of the state to enforce ideological uniformity. The original unstable compromise that temporarily held the conservative coalition together is now the foundation of our political division.